The blade whispered through the air with a sound that had ended 1,000 lives before this moment. Kira Valdez held the katana steady, its carbon steel edge catching the harsh fluorescent light of the detention bay as the hegemony. Interrogators circled her like a predator, sizing up wounded prey. "Fascinating," Commander Vexthal chittered, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among his kind. The arthropod's exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian, each segment perfectly engineered for war, a primitive metal blade. "How quaint." Kira's grip tightened on the leather-wrapped handle, but she said nothing. The blade had been her grandfather's, forged in the old tradition on Earth before the hegemony's first contact protocols, had turned humanity into a client species, before humans learned they were considered little more than clever animals by the galaxy's true powers. "Do you know what this is?" Vexthal gestured with one of his forearms toward the massive construct, dominating the far end of the detention bay. The Warframe stood 12 feet tall, a perfect fusion of organic neural networks and quantum-enhanced metallurgy. Its surface rippled with barely contained energy, weapon systems that could level city blocks humming at idle power. "This is what real warfare looks like, little mammal." The other prisoners pressed against the far walls, a mixture of human colonists and alien dissidents who had made the mistake of opposing hegemony expansion. They watched with hollow eyes, already broken by months of interrogation and re-education. All except the humans. Kira could see it in their faces, that stubborn spark that refused to die, even here in the belly of a hegemony dreadnought. "Your species fascinates us," Vexthal continued, stepping closer. His compound eyes reflected her image in 1,000 fractured pieces. Such creativity, such persistence, but ultimately such naivety. "You cling to these totems," he gestured dismissively at her katana, as if sentiment could overcome superior technology. Kira finally spoke, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You wanted to know why the Kepler 440 colony kept fighting even after you glassed their cities. Why they held out for 3 years against impossible odds. Indeed, your psychological profile suggests you were instrumental in their resistance. We require insight. The answer's simpler than you think." Kira shifted her stance slightly, muscles coiling with decades of training. The movement was subtle, but Vexthal's enhanced senses caught it immediately. His Warframe responded, energy levels spiking as targeting systems came online. "Enlighten us." "We fight because we're too stupid to know when we're beaten." Kira's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and to mean to care. The interrogation chamber fell silent except for the low hum of the Warframe's power systems. Vexthal studied her for a long moment, his alien features unreadable. Then he laughed, a sound like grinding metal, stupidity and meanness against the might of the hegemony, against quantum weaponry and neural enhancement, against a Warframe that could reduce this entire ship to component atoms. He gestured to his towering war machine. "Your blade cannot even scratch its hull plating, maybe." Kira adjusted her grip again, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon that had been passed down through 5 generations of her family. "But here's the thing about us stupid, mean humans. Commander, we don't need to win, we just need to make you bleed." The Warframe's targeting laser painted a red dot on her chest. Vexthal's mandibles spread wide in anticipation. "Then bleed you shall, little mammal. But first you will watch your primitive weapons shatter against true power. Consider it an educational experience." The prisoners held their breath. The interrogation was about to become an execution. But Kira Valdez stood ready, her grandfather's blade singing its ancient song of steel and defiance. In her eyes burned the fire that had driven humanity to the stars and would not be extinguished. Even here in the darkness between worlds, the dance of death was about to begin. The Warframe moved with impossible grace for something its size, neural networks processing tactical data faster than human thought. Vexthal's consciousness merged with the machine, transforming him into something beyond organic limitation. Plasma cannons swiveled to track Kira's movement. As she rolled behind a detention cell barrier, the first blast vaporized the plasteel, where she'd been standing, leaving a smoking crater in the deck plating. Superheated air rushed past her face as she sprinted along the wall, using the prison cells as cover. The other captives scrambled away from the battle, pressing themselves into corners as energy beams carved through their former shelter. Running already, Vextel's voice boomed from the Warframe's external speakers. How disappointing. I expected more from the architect of Kepler 442's resistance. Kira didn't waste breath on a reply. She'd studied hegemony combat doctrine during the 3-year siege, learned their weaknesses through blood and sacrifice. Warframes were devastating at range, but their size made them cumbersome in close quarters. The trick was getting close enough to matter. She sprinted toward a support pillar as another plasma burst seared the air behind her. The katana remained in its sheath, no point drawing it. Until she could use it effectively, the Warframe pivoted, servos whining as it tracked her movement. A missile pod opened on its shoulder, micro-rockets screaming toward her position. The explosion threw her sideways, shrapnel tearing through her prison uniform. Blood ran down her arm, but she kept moving. The Warframe was learning her patterns, quantum processors calculating optimal firing solutions. She had perhaps 30 seconds before it adapted completely to her tactics. Kira feinted left, then dove right as plasma fire followed her initial movement. The Warframe's left arm extended, revealing a rapid-fire energy projector that painted the wall behind her with coherent light. She rolled, came up running, and leaped onto a fallen detention barrier. Impressive agility, Vextel admitted, but agility without power is merely elaborate suicide. The Warframe's right arm transformed, armor plating sliding away to reveal a graviton manipulator. The air around Kira thickened, invisible forces trying to pin her in place. She felt her bones creak under the pressure, but her momentum carried her forward onto the Warframe's lower leg assembly. Now Vextel's overconfidence became a liability. The graviton field couldn't target her without damaging his own machine. Kira scrambled up the Warframe's leg, fingers finding purchase on weapon mounts and sensor rays. The katana came free of its sheath in one fluid motion. Impossible, Vextel snarled. The Warframe shook itself like a massive dog, trying to dislodge her. No primitive blade can penetrate quantum-enhanced armor. Kira said nothing. She'd reached the Warframe's hip joint, where armor segments overlapped to allow for articulation. Her grandfather had taught her that every armor had weak points. You just had to be willing to die finding them. The katana's point found the gap between plates, ancient steel sliding into the space where organic met machine. Vextel screamed. The Warframe's systems went haywire as the blade severed neural connections. Warning lights flashed red as error messages cascaded through the commander's enhanced senses. One leg seized up, servos locked in spasmodic contractions. But Kira had underestimated the machine's redundancy. Backup systems engaged, rerouting control pathways around the damaged area. The Warframe's left arm swung around, massive fingers closing on her torso. She felt ribs crack as it lifted her into the air. Clever. Vextel gasped, his voice distorted by pain and machine feedback, but insufficient. The Warframe's grip tightened. Kira felt her vision start to gray at the edges. In desperation, she grabbed the katana's handle with both hands and drove it deeper into the joint. Sparks flew as the blade found something vital. Vextel's triumphant laugh cut off abruptly. The Warframe's left leg collapsed, sending them both crashing to the deck. Kira rolled clear as 12 tons of war machine hit the floor with enough force to crack the hull plating. She came up gasping, blood running from a dozen cuts. The katana's blade had snapped off in the joint, leaving her with nothing but a broken handle. The Warframe struggled to rise, its damaged leg dragging uselessly. "You dare," Vextel's voice was pure rage now. "You dare wound a hegemony commander with your primitive trash?" Emergency systems activated throughout the Warframe. Armor plating retracted to reveal dozens of weapon systems Kira hadn't seen before. The machine was preparing to unleash everything it had. Collateral damage be damned. "I'm going to vaporize every atom of your miserable existence," Vextel promised. "And then I'm going to do the same to every human on this ship. You want to make me bleed? I'll paint these walls with your species' extinction." Kira tossed aside the broken sword handle and smiled. Blood ran down her face, but her eyes held no fear. "That's the problem with you hegemony types," she said. You always assume we're fighting alone. The detention bay's emergency locks disengaged. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, Captain Marcus Steele stepped through the breach, followed by 24 human prisoners who had somehow acquired hegemony plasma rifles. Their eyes held the cold fire of people with nothing left to lose. "Took you long enough," Kira called out, wiping blood from her split lip. "Traffic was heavy in the corridors," Steele replied, his weathered face split by a savage grin. The former Colonial Defense Force officer had been scheduled for execution tomorrow. Now he hefted a stolen plasma cannon like it weighed nothing. "Hope you saved some fun for the rest of us." Vexthal's compound eyes tracked the new rivals as his Warframe's systems finished their emergency reboot. "Impossible. The ship's security is currently dealing with riots on 12 other decks." Steele interrupted. "Funny how prisoners get restless when you start executing their friends, especially when those friends happen to be very good at picking locks." The Warframe rose to its full height, damaged leg servos screaming in protest. Weapons systems came online in a cascade of targeting lasers and power indicators. But Vexthal's confidence had taken a serious blow. The humans shouldn't have been able to coordinate an escape, shouldn't have known the ship's layout well enough to stage simultaneous uprisings. "You've been planning this," he realized. "For 3 months," Kira confirmed. "Ever since you captured the first batch of Kepler survivors. Did you really think we'd just sit quietly in our cells?" The escaped prisoners spread out, using debris and structural supports as cover. They moved with military precision, years of colonial warfare having taught them that survival meant adaptation. The plasma rifles were unfamiliar, but the principles of combined arms tactics remained constant across species. Steele raised his fist, and 23 weapons trained on the Warframe. "Light him up." Plasma fire erupted from every angle, coherent energy streams converging on Vexthal's position. The Warframe's shields flared to life, deflecting most of the barrage, but the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming its defensive matrix. Warning indicators flashed as power levels dropped toward critical thresholds. The commander's response was swift and devastating. Missile pods opened across the Warframe's torso, unleashing a storm of micromunitions that turned the detention bay into a holocaust of fire and flying metal. 3 humans died instantly, vaporized by direct hits. 2 more fell screaming as shrapnel tore through their bodies. But the survivors kept firing. They'd learned the hard way that hesitation meant death when facing hegemony technology. Better to die fighting than on their knees in an execution chamber. Persistent little mammals. Vexthal snarled. His main cannon swiveled toward Steele's position. "Allow me to demonstrate why the hegemony rules the galaxy." The plasma beam carved through the bulkhead like it was paper, superheated metal spraying in all directions. Steele dove clear as his cover disintegrated, rolling behind a fallen support beam. The beam tracked him, liquefying everything it touched. Kira sprinted toward the wreckage of her earlier fight, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. The broken katana handle caught her eye, useless for cutting, but the tang still held a few inches of sharp steel. Not much, but humans had always been good at making do with less. "Sarah Jenkins." Tora's flank left, Steele shouted over the sound of weapons fire. "Keep that bastard busy while the graviton manipulator activated again," crushing Sarah Martinez against the bulkhead with invisible force. Her scream cut off abruptly as her ribcage collapsed. The Warframe's targeting systems had adapted to their tactics, anticipating flanking maneuvers and countering them with lethal efficiency. "Is this your plan?" Vexthal taunted. "Throw yourselves at me until I run out of ammunition?" How very human. But Kira noticed something the commander hadn't. The Warframe's damaged leg was leaking hydraulic fluid, creating a growing pool beneath the machine. More importantly, the earlier damage to its neural interface was causing micro-delays in its targeting system. The delays were measured in milliseconds, but in combat, milliseconds could mean the difference between life and death. She caught Steele's eye and gestured toward the leak. The veteran officer's gaze followed hers, and understanding flashed across his features. He nodded grimly and began repositioning his remaining people. "Rodriguez, "Chen, concentrate fire on the right knee joint," he ordered. "Everyone else, pattern Delta 7 on my mark." The Warframe's sensors detected the shift in human tactics, but Vexthal was too focused on individual targets to see the larger picture. His machine had become the most sophisticated weapons platform in the galaxy, but it was still dependent on the organic intelligence controlling it. And organic intelligence, no matter how enhanced, could make mistakes. "Foolish," he muttered, selecting his next target. "You cannot win with conventional." The concentrated plasma fire struck the Warframe's right knee, just as it shifted weight to compensate for the damaged left leg. Superheated metal screamed as armor plating began to fail. The hydraulic leak became a fountain as pressure seals ruptured. The war machine staggered, and for a moment, Vexthal felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of conquest: genuine fear. Not for his life, his consciousness could be transferred to a new body if necessary, but fear of failure, of being defeated by the species the hegemony considered barely sentient. "No," he whispered, then louder, "No, every weapon system on." The Warframe activated simultaneously, turning the detention bay into an inferno of death. The humans scattered like leaves before a hurricane, but there was nowhere to run. The commander had decided that if he couldn't win cleanly, he'd take as many of them with him as possible. The real battle was just beginning. The detention bay had become a charnel house. Bodies lay scattered among the twisted wreckage of prison, cells and support structures, human and alien blood mixing in spreading pools. The air itself seemed to burn with residual energy from weapons fire, and the acrid smell of vaporized metal filled what remained of the atmosphere processors. 8 of Steele's people were dead. 5 more were wounded, their agonized breathing punctuating the brief lulls between exchanges of fire. The Warframe stood in the center of the carnage like a monument to mechanized death, its weapons systems cycling through target acquisition patterns with remorseless efficiency. But Vexthal was learning a hard truth about human warfare. They adapted faster than any species the hegemony had encountered. Each casualty taught the survivors something new about their enemy's capabilities. Each near miss revealed another weakness in the Warframe's defensive matrix. Pattern 7 Alpha. Steele whispered into his improvised comm system, strips of metal torn from the walls and configured to create a basic electromagnetic resonance network. The humans had rigged it during their initial escape, knowing they'd need coordination to survive. Execute on 3 count. The remaining fighters shifted position with practiced precision. They'd abandoned their original positions, using the Warframe's own weapons fire to create new cover from the melted ruins of the detention bay. Rodriguez belly crawled through a gap in the twisted metal, his plasma rifle trained on the war machine's sensor cluster. Chen and Williams flanked right, using the bodies of their fallen comrades as concealment. It was a tactic that would have horrified civilized species, using the dead as shields. But the humans had learned long ago that civilization was a luxury they couldn't afford when fighting for their species' survival. Kira had found her own position among the wreckage, the broken katana handle gripped in her white-knuckled fist. The tang's jagged metal had been sharpened against debris, creating a crude but lethal point. She studied the Warframe's movement patterns, looking for the moment of vulnerability she knew had to exist. "Pathetic," Vexthal snarled, his voice distorted by the machine's speakers. "You scurry through the ruins like vermin. Is this the mighty human spirit we've heard so much about?" His response came in the form of concentrated plasma fire from 3 directions simultaneously. The Warframe's shields flared as they absorbed the barrage, power levels dropping into the yellow zone. The machine's quantum processors calculated optimal response patterns, but something was wrong. The humans weren't firing to destroy, they were firing to provoke specific reactions. Too late. Vexthal realized the trap. The coordinated attacks had forced him to activate all primary defensive systems simultaneously, creating a massive power drain. For exactly 2.3 seconds, the Warframe's backup systems would be offline as the main reactor cycled through its reset. Sequence. Kira moved. She erupted from her hiding place like a guided missile. The makeshift blade extended in front of her as she sprinted toward the Warframe's wounded left leg. The machine's targeting systems tracked her movement, but couldn't acquire a lock. She was too close to the hull, lost in the sensor shadow created by the war machine's own bulk. The sharpened tang punched through the hydraulic leak's rupture, finding the main pressure line that controlled the leg's actuators. High-pressure fluid exploded outward, coating Kira in scalding mechanical blood as the entire leg assembly seized up. Vexthal screamed in rage and pain as his connection to the limb severed. Completely, the Warframe toppled sideways, 12 tons of sophisticated death machine crashing into the bulkhead, with enough force to crack the ship's structural frame. But the commander wasn't finished. Emergency gyroscopes activated, stabilizing the fallen machine. Weapon ports opened along the Warframe's prone form, revealing armaments designed for ground-based combat. If he couldn't stand, he'd turn the detention bay into a killing field. From a horizontal position, "You want primitive," he roared. "I'll show you primitive." A napalm projector emerged from the Warframe's chest cavity, designed for clearing bunkers and sterilizing enemy positions. The chemical fire would burn through metal and flesh alike, leaving nothing but ash and screaming. Steel saw the weapon deploy and knew they were all dead. His remaining ammunition wouldn't penetrate the Warframe's frontal armor, and they had no cover that could survive liquid fire. He keyed his improvised comm one last time. "All units, pattern Omega. Repeat, pattern Omega." The humans stopped firing and looked at their commander. Pattern Omega wasn't a tactical formation, it was a farewell, an acknowledgement that they'd fought as hard as they could, inflicted what damage they were able, and now faced the end with whatever dignity remained to them. But Kira Valdez had other ideas. She'd landed hard when the Warframe fell, her left shoulder dislocated and blood streaming from a dozen cuts. The makeshift blade was lost somewhere in the wreckage. By all rights, she should have been finished, a broken human facing an enemy that could level cities. Instead, she began to laugh. The sound was soft at first, barely audible over the Warframe's power systems, but it grew stronger, taking on a hysterical edge that made Vexthal's compound eyes narrow in confusion. What did the primitive have to be happy about? "You know what your problem is, Commander," Kira called out, her voice carrying clearly across the ruined detention bay. "You never learned the most important thing about fighting humans. And what would that be, little mammal?" Kira's smile was bright with madness and determination. "We cheat." The explosive charges hidden throughout the detention bay detonated in perfect sequence. The humans had been rigging them for weeks, using components scavenged from their own equipment and placed during cleaning details and work assignments. The hegemony guards had never thought to check after all. What could primitive prisoners possibly accomplish with access to basic tools? The shaped charges weren't designed to destroy the Warframe. They couldn't generate enough force, but they were precisely positioned to collapse specific sections of the detention bay's superstructure, creating a cascade failure that would trap the war machine in a cage of twisted metal and sealed blast doors. As debris rained down around them, Kira caught Steele's eye one last time. "Phase 2, she said. The real war was about to begin. The shaped charges had done more than trap the Warframe. They'd breached the detention bay's hull integrity, triggering emergency lockdown protocols throughout the dreadnought. Blast doors slammed shut in corridors across 17 decks as the ship's AI attempted to contain what it perceived as critical structural damage. What the AI didn't know was that the humans had been studying its responses for months, learning to weaponize the hegemony's own safety systems against them. Captain Steele's bloodied fingers worked frantically at an exposed control panel as alarms shrieked around them. "Valdez, how long do we have?" "Maybe 10 minutes before they override the lockdowns," Kira replied, dragging herself across the debris-strewn floor toward the trapped Warframe. Her left arm hung useless at her side, but her right hand still gripped a plasma cutter she'd salvaged from the wreckage. Less if Vexthal manages to break free. The commander was indeed trying to escape his metal prison, the Warframe's remaining functional systems straining against the collapsed superstructure. Servo motors whined in protest as they attempted to lift tons of twisted hull plating. Emergency. Cutting lasers carved through debris with surgical precision. But the humans had chosen their trap well, every piece of metal cut away. only caused more wreckage to shift down from above. Fascinating, came Vexthal's voice from the Warframe's external speakers, distorted but still carrying that arrogant undertone. You've managed to temporarily inconvenience me, but this ship carries a crew of 12,000 hegemony warriors. Do you really think your pathetic uprising can? His words were cut off by the sound of explosions, echoing through the ship's corridors. Distant screams and weapon fire filtered through the ventilation systems as other groups of human prisoners put their own plans into action. The simultaneous uprisings Steele had mentioned earlier weren't just diversions. They were coordinated strikes against critical ship systems. Rodriguez limped over to join them, his leg torn open by shrapnel, but his eyes bright with fierce determination. Engineering section's been compromised, he reported. Chen's group managed to sabotage the primary power couplings before the guards put them down. We've got maybe 30 minutes before they restore full ship function. 30 minutes to cripple a dreadnought that could glass planets. The math was insane, but humans had been defying impossible odds since they first looked up at the stars and decided they belonged there. Kira activated the plasma cutter and began working on the Warframe's exposed joint where her improvised blade had struck earlier. The concentrated energy beam ate through quantum-enhanced armor like acid through flesh, revealing the complex neural interfaces that connected Vexthal's consciousness to his mechanical body. "What are you doing?" the commander demanded, his voice taking on a note of genuine concern for the first time. "Learning." Kira replied without looking up. Sparks flew as the cutter severed another connection. "Every system you've ever built has weaknesses. Every advantage can be turned against you. That's what you never understood about the Kepler colonies. We weren't just fighting your occupation. We were studying you." The Warframe's struggles became more frantic as critical systems went offline. Warning lights flashed across its surface as backup processors attempted to reroute around damaged components. But Kira's assault was surgical, targeting specific neural pathways she'd identified during their earlier fight. Meanwhile, Steele had managed to access the ship's internal communication system. His weathered face was grim as he processed the incoming reports from other sections of the dreadnought. Williams' team hit the reactor controls on Deck 7. He announced 12 casualties, but they managed to destabilize the containment matrix. Torres took out the main sensor ray before they cut her down. And Henderson, he paused, jaw tightening. Henderson's group breached the armory on Deck 12. They're distributing heavy weapons to the remaining prisoners. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the adjacent corridor's hegemony. Security forces moving to retake the detention bay. Their electromagnetic signatures showed heavy weapons and personal armor. Elite troops equipped for dealing with dangerous prisoners. But they were moving cautiously, unsure what other surprises the humans might have prepared. "How many?" Kira asked, still working on the Warframe's neural interfaces. 50, maybe 60. Full battle gear. Steele checked his plasma rifle's charge indicator and grimaced. "We've got maybe enough ammunition for one more firefight. Then, we'd better make it count." The cutting beam sliced through another cluster of connections, and Vexthal screamed as his sensory input fractured into static. The Warframe's left arm went completely dead, servos locking in place as their control signals vanished. But the machine still had plenty of fight left in it. "You cannot comprehend what you're facing," Vexthal gasped, his voice fragmenting as his connection to the Warframe's communication systems destabilized. "The hegemony has conquered 1,000 species. Your primitive tactics cannot. Our primitive tactics have been killing your people for 3 years." Kira interrupted, "And we've gotten very, very good at it." The first hegemony soldiers appeared at the sealed entrance to the detention bay, their powered armor gleaming under the emergency lighting. Plasma cutters began eating through the blast door as the strike team prepared for entry. Their movements were professional, coordinated. They'd dealt with prisoner uprisings before, but they'd never dealt with humans who had nothing left to lose. Steele positioned his remaining people in a defensive perimeter around the trapped Warframe, using the war machine itself as cover. It was a desperate gambit if the soldiers had heavy weapons. The crossfire would kill everyone in the bay, but it was also psychologically devastating. The hegemony's own ultimate weapon had become a shield for the primitives they'd tried to Crushed, the blast door collapsed inward with a thunderous crash. Armored figures poured through the breach, energy weapons raised and targeting systems active. For a moment, the two forces faced each other across the debris-strewn battlefield, predator and prey sizing each other up. Then the killing began in earnest. Plasma fire erupted from both sides simultaneously, turning the detention bay into a storm of coherent energy and flying metal. The hegemony soldiers advanced in textbook formation, their superior equipment and training evident in every movement. But the humans fought with a ferocity that went beyond mere desperation. They fought with the accumulated rage of a species that had been written off as inconsequential. Rodriguez died in the first exchange, his chest vaporized by a direct hit from a heavy plasma cannon. Williams lasted 3 seconds longer before a targeting beam found him behind his improvised cover. But they'd bought precious time for their remaining comrades to adjust their positions and return fire. The battle raged for 17 minutes of pure hell. When it ended, 38 hegemony soldiers lay dead among the wreckage, their advanced armor no match for the humans' intimate knowledge of the detention bay's layout, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at victory. Only 3 humans remained alive: Steele, Kira, and a young colonial named Davies, who'd lost his left eye to shrapnel, but kept fighting anyway. They were surrounded by the dead, coated in blood and debris, their weapons exhausted and their bodies pushed beyond endurance, but they were still standing. And in her hand, Kira held the neural interface core she'd finally managed to extract from the Warframe's damaged systems. VxL-S consciousness writhed within the crystalline matrix, trapped and vulnerable for the first time in his long military career. "Now," Kira said, her voice hoarse from shouting over weapons fire, "let's have that conversation about primitive technology." The neural interface core pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, each flash representing VxL-S' desperate attempts to escape his crystalline prison. Kira held it up to the emergency lighting, studying the complex matrix of organic circuits and quantum processors that housed the commander's consciousness. 300 years of military experience, tactical knowledge, and strategic planning all compressed into a device no larger than her fist. "Remarkable," she murmured, ignoring the pain radiating from her dislocated shoulder. "The hegemony's greatest achievement. They've figured out how to store a soul in a machine." "Release me," VxL-S' voice emanated from the core's microspeakers, distorted and fragmented, but still carrying that familiar arrogance. "You have no comprehension of what you're dealing with. That interface contains classified military data that could what? Give us an advantage." Captain Steele limped over, his left leg dragging behind him. The plasma burn on his thigh had gone straight through muscle and bone, but he'd refused to let it slow him down. "Davies, how's our situation?" The young colonial was monitoring their improvised communication network, blood from his ruined eye socket still dripping down his cheek. "Not good, sir. Hegemony reinforcements are cutting through the blast doors on decks 5 and 7. We've got maybe 15 minutes before they breach this section. 15 minutes to turn the tide of a battle that had been raging for 3 years. 15 minutes to prove that humanity deserved a place among the stars, rather than in servitude to their alien masters." Kira connected the neural core to a salvaged interface unit, her fingers dancing over controls she'd learned through months of covert study. The hegemony's technology was advanced, but it followed logical principles and humans had always been exceptionally good at reverse engineering things they weren't supposed to understand. "What are you doing?" VxL demanded as data streams began flowing across the improvised display. "That interface is not designed for primitive neural architecture. You'll kill yourself and destroy your consciousness in the process." Kira finished. "Yes, I'm aware of the risks." But she wasn't just attempting to access VxL-S memories. The neural core contained something far more valuable: real-time command codes for every hegemony ship in the sector, including the dreadnought they were currently trapped aboard. Warning alarms shrieked as Kira's makeshift connection established a link to the ship's primary computer. The AI systems recoiled from the unauthorized access attempt, security protocols activating in cascading waves. But the humans had learned to exploit those same protocols during their months of captivity. "Davies, execute pattern Omega-7, Steele ordered." The colonial's fingers flew over his communication array, sending coded signals to human resistance cells throughout the ship. They'd been preparing for this moment, the point where desperation and opportunity intersected to create a chance at impossible victory. Explosions bloomed throughout the dreadnought as hidden charges detonated in carefully selected locations. Not enough to destroy the ship, they needed it intact, but sufficient to cripple its defensive systems and create chaos among the crew. Emergency bulkheads sealed automatically, dividing the massive vessel into isolated sections. Ingenious, Vexthal admitted reluctantly, but ultimately futile. Even if you manage to seize control of this ship, you cannot escape the system. The hegemony maintains a blockade of 12 dreadnoughts and 47 cruisers. Your primitive vessels cannot. We're not trying to escape, Kira interrupted, her consciousness diving deeper into the neural interface. She could feel Vexthal's mind pressing against hers. 3 centuries of military conditioning trying to overwhelm her human psyche. But she'd learned something during the siege of Kepler 442 that the hegemony had never understood. Humans didn't break the same way other species did. They bent, they adapted, they found ways to endure that defied all logical analysis. Then what? Vexthal's question cut off as understanding dawned. No, you wouldn't dare. The consequences would be acceptable, Kira said simply. Her hands moved across the interface controls with increasing confidence, muscle memory from months of covert practice guiding her movements. Davies, are Henderson's people in position? Affirmative. They've secured the reactor control room and are standing by for your signal. The Dreadnought's reactor was a masterpiece of hegemony engineering, a controlled fusion reaction that could power a small city for decades. But like all fusion reactors, it could be weaponized under the right circumstances. The resulting explosion would vaporize everything within a 50-kilometer radius. You're insane, Vexthal whispered. This ship carries 12,000 souls. You would murder them all to save 12 billion humans from extinction? Steele's voice was iron. To ensure that humanity survives to see another generation? Yes, Commander, we would. Kira felt the neural interface's connection stabilize as her consciousness merged partially with Vexthal's stored memories. The sensation was nauseating, alien thoughts and experiences flooding her human mind like poison. But buried within the commander's tactical knowledge were the command codes she needed. Through the ship's sensors, she could perceive the entire hegemony blockade. 12 dreadnoughts ranged in a perfect sphere around the Kepler system, their weapons trained on the handful of human colonies that had somehow survived 3 years of systematic bombardment. The aliens had been methodical in their approach to genocide, starving out resistance, rather than risking their own casualties in direct assault. But they'd made one critical error. They'd underestimated human ingenuity. Steele, Kira called out, her voice strained from the neural connection. I've got access to their fleet communications. Henderson's group needs to begin the reactor overload sequence now. Davies, signal Henderson. Execute Phase 3. The young colonial's transmission went out, just as hegemony reinforcements finally breached the detention bay's outer defenses. Armored figures poured through smoking gaps in the bulkhead, weapons raised and targeting systems painting red dots across the wreckage-strewn chamber. But something was wrong with their equipment. Targeting computers flickered erratically as conflicting signals flooded their networks, weapon systems cycling between standby and active modes. As command protocols fought each other for priority, the soldiers hesitated, unsure whether their own technology could be trusted. Now, Kira whispered. Every screen throughout the dreadnought flickered to the same image. Captain Marcus Steele's weathered face, streaked with blood and lit by emergency lighting. His voice echoed through corridors and command centers as the ship's communication system broadcast his message to every soul aboard. Attention, hegemony forces. This is Captain Marcus Steele of the Terran Colonial Defense Force. In 60 seconds, this ship's reactor will undergo catastrophic overload. You have one chance to save your lives. Order the immediate withdrawal of all hegemony forces from the Kepler system and guarantee safe passage for human civilians to neutral space. The response was immediate chaos. Bridge officers shouted contradictory orders as they tried to regain control of their own systems. Security teams rushed toward the reactor levels, only to find their access codes had been changed. Emergency protocols designed to prevent exactly this scenario activated and deactivated in random patterns. "This is impossible," Vexthal gasped, his consciousness reeling as Kira continued to plunder his stored knowledge. "Human neural architecture cannot interface with our technology. The quantum matrices will reject your mistake," Kira grunted. Through gritted teeth, was assuming human brains work like everyone else's. "We're not quantum processors, Commander. We're chaos engines, and chaos is very, very good at breaking rigid systems." 50 seconds. The hegemony reinforcements in the detention bay had given up trying to use their compromised equipment. They fell back on basic kinetic weapons, projectile rifles, and explosive charges that didn't depend on quantum computing systems. But Steele and Davies had positioned themselves behind the disabled Warframe, using its armored bulk as cover. 40 seconds. Throughout the ship, human prisoners seized control of critical systems as their captors struggled with malfunctioning technology. Years of careful observation and preparation were paying off as maintenance crews, cleaning staff, and work details revealed their true nature: soldiers of the Colonial Defense Force, intelligence operatives, and demolition specialists who had allowed themselves to be captured to get inside the hegemony's most secure installations. 30 seconds. Fleet Admiral Crexithal to all vessels. A new voice crackled over the communication channels. "Stand down weapons systems and prepare for immediate withdrawal. Acknowledge receipt and compliance." Kira felt a savage smile cross her bloodied lips. The hegemony's rigid command structure had become a liability. No individual ship captain dared ignore a direct order from a fleet admiral, even when that order came through compromised communication. "Channels. 20 seconds. You've doomed yourselves," Vexthal whispered. "Even if you escape this system, the hegemony will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy. Humanity will be marked for extinction. Then we'll make them regret it," Steele replied calmly. "Every single day." 10 seconds. The Dreadnought's reactor safety systems engaged, attempting to prevent overload. But Henderson's team had spent months learning the intricate details of hegemony fusion technology. They'd identified 17 different ways to bypass the safety protocols, and they'd implemented all of them simultaneously. 5 seconds. Through the ship's sensors, Kira watched as the hegemony blockade began its withdrawal. Massive vessels that had dominated local space for 3 years were actually turning away, their crews unable to distinguish between legitimate orders and human deception. 3 seconds. The reactor achieved critical mass. 2 seconds. For Kepler, Kira whispered. 1 second. The detonation that followed could be seen from 3 star systems away. The explosion birthed a new star in the Kepler system, however briefly. Fusion fire expanded outward in a perfect sphere, consuming the Dreadnought and everything within 50 kilometers in the space of a heartbeat. The shockwave traveled at light speed through the quantum foam that connected all matter, carrying with it a message that would echo across the galaxy. Humanity would not go quietly into extinction. But Captain Marcus Steele never saw it. He died 3 minutes before the reactor achieved overload, his body finally succumbing to the plasma burns and internal injuries he'd sustained during the final battle. His last words were a tactical assessment transmitted to other human resistance cells. Throughout the sector, pattern Omega-7 successful. Repeat, Omega-7 successful. Tell them we held the line. Davies lasted 30 seconds longer, bleeding out from his wounds while maintaining the communication link that had coordinated the uprising. The young colonial's final transmission was simpler. Terra remembers. Only Kira Valdez survived to witness the Dreadnought's destruction. The neural interface had protected her consciousness during the reactor overload, creating a quantum bubble that preserved her awareness even as her physical body was vaporized along with everything else. She existed for those final moments as pure thought. Her mind merged with the dying echoes of Vexthal's stored memories. The commander's last sensation was not pain or regret, but profound confusion. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never encountered a species that would deliberately destroy itself. to achieve a tactical objective. The concept was so alien to hegemony thinking that he could not process it, even as annihilation consumed them both. Why? He asked in those final microseconds before their shared consciousness dissolved into quantum foam. Kira's answer was the last human words spoken in the Kepler system, because someone has to. The news of the dreadnought's destruction spread through human space like wildfire. Not through official channels the colonial government had surrendered to the hegemony months earlier, but through the underground networks that connected resistance cells across 100 worlds. The message was always the same. 37 prisoners had somehow destroyed the most advanced warship in the galaxy, taking 12,000 hegemony soldiers with them. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Across the galaxy, other species that had submitted to hegemony rule began to whisper among themselves. If humans considered the most primitive of the client races could inflict such damage, what might be possible if multiple species coordinated their efforts? The cracks in the hegemony's facade of invincibility began to show, but the immediate, tactical consequences were even more significant. The destruction of Dreadnought 7th of the line had eliminated not just a ship, but the entire command structure for the Kepler occupation force. The explosion had vaporized Admiral Crexithal's flagship, along with the quantum communication arrays that linked the blockade to high command. The surviving ships found themselves leaderless, their captains uncertain whether the withdrawal orders they'd received were legitimate or part of the human deception. In that moment of confusion, the human survivors struck. Hidden bases throughout the outer system activated, launching waves of improvised missiles and converted mining ships at the scattered hegemony vessels. The weapons were crewed by galactic standards fusion bombs strapped to cargo haulers, mining lasers jury-rigged for military use, but they were deployed with the tactical knowledge that Kira Valdez had extracted from Vextal's memories. The humans knew exactly where each ship's weak points were located. 3 more hegemony vessels were destroyed in the first hour. 2 others were badly damaged, their crews forced to abandon ship. The remainder fled the system entirely, carrying with them reports of human savagery that would influence hegemony policy for decades to come. But victory came at a terrible price. The Kepler colonies had been home to 15 million humans before the war began. By the time the last hegemony ship disappeared beyond the heliopause, fewer than 2 million survivors remained. Entire worlds had been rendered uninhabitable, their atmospheres poisoned, and their ecosystems destroyed. The cost of freedom had been measured in the lives of children who would never be born and cities that would never be rebuilt. The survivors didn't celebrate, they mourned. Memorial walls went up on every inhabited world, listing the names of those who had died fighting for humanity's future. Marcus Steele's name was carved at the top, followed by Davies and Rodriguez and Williams and all the others who had given their lives in the detention bay. But the longest list belonged to those who had died before the final battle, the miners and farmers and teachers who had taken up arms against impossible odds, simply because surrender was not in their nature. At the very bottom of every memorial, etched in letters that caught the light of foreign suns, was a single line: Kira Valdez. She held the line. 5 years later, a hegemony archaeological team surveying the Kepler system's asteroid belt made an unusual discovery. Embedded in a chunk of fused metal that had once been part of Dreadnought 7th of the line, they found a piece of carbon steel no larger than a child's finger. Analysis revealed it to be part of an ancient human weapon, a katana forged using techniques that predated their species' entry into galactic civilization. The blade fragment had somehow survived the nuclear fires that consumed the Dreadnought, its molecular structure altered, but not destroyed by exposure to temperatures that should have vaporized any known material. Hegemony scientists studied it for months, trying to understand how primitive metallurgy could withstand forces that would obliterate quantum-enhanced armor. They never found an answer. The fragment was eventually placed in a museum on the hegemony capital world, labeled as a curiosity from an extinct species. Visitors would pass by the display case without a second glance, more interested in the exotic weapons and technologies of the galaxy's advanced civilizations. But sometimes, late at night when the museum was closed and empty, the security guards reported hearing something impossible, the whisper of steel cutting through air, faint but unmistakable. They dismissed it as imagination, the product of tired minds and long shifts. They were wrong. The sound was memory, the echo of a blade that had tasted hegemony blood and would never forget the feel of victory. It was the ghost of human defiance, preserved in carbon and iron, waiting for the day when it would be needed again. And in the vast darkness between the stars, that day was coming. The hegemony had learned to fear humanity's ingenuity, their refusal to accept defeat, their willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at freedom. But they had not yet learned the most dangerous truth about humans. They never forgot, and they never forgave. The war that began at Kepler 442 would spread across the galaxy, carried by refugees who had seen their homeworlds burn and survivors who remembered every name on every memorial wall. They would teach other species that freedom was worth dying for, that even the most primitive weapons could split apart the most advanced armor, if wielded by someone with nothing left to lose. The blade had been broken, but its edge remained sharp, and somewhere in the quantum foam that connected all matter, a voice still whispered, "Someone has to hold the line."